Cowboy lost a bet, made to marry a black beauty. What happened next shocked everyone. Jake Turner had always believed that a man's word was everything. In the small Texas town where he lived, reputation traveled faster than the wind across the open fields, and Jake's reputation was strong. At 29 years old, he was known as the best young cowboy in the county. He rode harder, worked longer, and spoke louder than most men around him. People said he had never backed down from a challenge. Some admired him. Others thought he was too proud. But no one ever doubted his confidence. The summer that changed his life began like any other. The days were hot and long. Dust floated in the air as cattle moved across wide land under the bright sun. Jake spent most of his time training for the annual rodeo championship. He had won it 3 years in a row. To him, winning again was not just a goal. It was expected. Losing was something that happened to other people. Every evening after work, he met his closest friends at Mason's ranch house. They would sit on wooden chairs outside, drinking cold lemonade and laughing about the day's events. Mason, his best friend since childhood, enjoyed teasing him the most. "You're good with horses," Mason would say with a grin, "but you're scared of settling down." Jake would laugh loudly and shake his head. "I'm not scared of anything." "You've turned down every woman who showed interest." Another friend added, "Maybe you're afraid someone will finally tame you." That night, the teasing went further than usual. The sky was turning orange as the sun set, and the mood was playful. Jake, feeling proud and relaxed, stood up and made a bold statement. "If I lose this year's rodeo," he said confidently, "I'll marry whoever Mason chooses. Doesn't matter who." Someone clapped. Someone else whistled. Mason raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Jake crossed his arms. "I don't lose. Just words spoken between friends under an open sky. No one thought it would matter." After all, Jake had never lost before. The day of the rodeo arrived with excitement filling the entire town. Families gathered early, children ran around with flags, and the announcer's voice echoed across the field. The competition was tougher than usual. Cowboys from neighboring counties had come to challenge the champion. Jake felt ready. His horse moved smoothly beneath him. The first round went well. The second round was strong too. The crowd cheered his name. It seemed like another easy victory. But in the final round, something unexpected happened. As Jake rode into the arena, the wind picked up suddenly. Dust swirled. His horse, usually calm and obedient, reacted to the noise of the crowd and shifted slightly off balance. It was only a small mistake, almost invisible to most people. But in a competition decided by points, small mistakes matter. When the scores were announced, silence fell across the field. Jake had lost his just 1 point. For a moment, he didn't move. The world felt quiet around him. He forced a smile and congratulated the winner. But inside, his pride felt bruised. Losing was unfamiliar, uncomfortable. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared and people returned home, Mason approached him slowly. "You remember what you said?" Mason asked gently. Jake looked away, knowing exactly what he meant. "It was just talk," Jake replied. "You said your word was everything." The other friends gathered around. None of them were laughing now. The joke had become real. Jake took a deep breath. In their town, promises mattered. Backing out would damage more than his pride. "Fine," he said finally. "Who did you choose?" Avana Brooks. He had heard of her. Everyone had. She was new in town, having moved there just months earlier. She had inherited land from a distant relative and was trying to manage it alone. People described her as independent and strong-minded. She kept to herself and didn't seem impressed by anyone. "She won't agree," Jake said quickly. "That's not what I heard," Mason replied. "She's willing to meet." Jake felt something unfamiliar. Nervousness. The next afternoon, he saw her properly for the first time. She stood near the fence of her land, wearing simple jeans and a light shirt, her dark hair tied back neatly. She wasn't trying to attract attention. Yet she stood out naturally. There was confidence in the way she carried herself. When Jake approached, she didn't smile widely or act shy. "So," she said calmly, "you made a promise." Her voice was steady, not mocking, not impressed. "It was a joke," Jake admitted, "but I keep my word." Savannah studied him carefully, as if trying to understand the man behind the reputation. "I don't believe in jokes about marriage," she said, "but I do believe in honesty." He respected that. They spoke for nearly an hour. What surprised Jake most was that she wasn't angry or offended. Instead, she spoke practically. Managing her land alone had been difficult. Workers often took advantage of her inexperience. She needed someone who understood ranch life. In return, she could help with finances and organization, skills she had learned before moving to town. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't emotional. It was a calm, serious discussion between two adults. "Are you saying you would actually consider this?" Jake asked, still unsure. "I would consider a partnership," she replied, "not a game." For the first time since losing the rodeo, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't about proving himself to his friends. It was about responsibility. News spread quickly through town. Some people laughed. Others were shocked. Many believed it wouldn't happen. But a week later, Jake and Savannah stood at the courthouse. No music. Just a simple room and a few witnesses. Mason stood quietly in the corner, looking half proud and half guilty. Jake glanced at Savannah before signing the papers. She looked calm, steady, unafraid. He realized then that she was braver than most people he knew. When the ceremony ended, there was no dramatic celebration. They stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun as husband and wife. People stared. Jake felt every whisper in the air. But Savannah walked beside him without hesitation. That evening, as they arrived at the ranch house where they would now live together, Jake understood something clearly. He had lost a rodeo. He had lost a bet. But what he had stepped into was far bigger than either of those things. Standing on the porch, watching the sky turn pink and gold, he wondered whether this loss might turn into something he had never expected. For the first time in his life, the fearless cowboy wasn't sure what would happen next, and that uncertainty was both frightening and strangely exciting. The first morning after their simple courthouse wedding felt strange for both of them. The ranch house was quiet, but the silence was different now. It no longer belonged to one person. It belonged to two people who barely knew each other. Jake woke up earlier than usual. For a few seconds he forgot what had happened. Then he remembered. He was married. He sat up in bed and stared at the wooden ceiling. He had always imagined that if he ever got married, it would happen slowly. There would be long talks, shared dreams, and maybe even love. Instead, his marriage had started because of a lost rodeo and a promise made in pride. He stepped outside onto the porch and noticed something surprising. Savannah was already awake. She stood near the barn, speaking to one of the ranch workers. She wasn't dressed in fancy clothes. She wore jeans, boots, and a simple shirt. Her hair was tied back neatly. She held a small notebook in her hand and was asking calm but clear questions about feed costs and fence repairs. Jake leaned against the porch railing and watched. Most people in town had assumed she would struggle with ranch life. They believed she was too refined, too different. But there she was, listening carefully, writing down numbers, and giving instructions without raising her voice. When she noticed Jake watching, she walked toward him. "We need to talk about the east fence," she said, as if this had always been normal between them. "It's weak in two places. If we don't fix it soon, we'll have problems." "You already checked the fences?" She nodded. "I couldn't sleep much. So I decided to make myself useful." There was no sarcasm in her tone, just honesty. Jake felt something shift inside him again. He had expected awkwardness, complaints, maybe regret. Instead, she acted like someone who had chosen to be there. They began discussing ranch matters as if they had been partners for years. She showed him the notebook where she had listed expenses and possible ways to reduce waste. Her handwriting was neat and organized. "You're good with numbers," Jake admitted. "I had to be," she replied. "When you manage land alone, you learn quickly." The first week of living together was careful and polite. They shared meals at the same table, but spoke mostly about work. They respected each other's space. At night, the house remained quiet. There were no dramatic conversations or sudden changes, just two determined people adjusting to a new reality. In town, gossip grew stronger. Some people believed the marriage wouldn't last a month. Others thought Savannah had trapped Jake for his land. A few whispered that Jake would soon regret everything. Savannah heard the rumors but never reacted. When she walked through town to buy supplies, she kept her head high. If someone greeted her kindly, she smiled. If someone stared, she ignored it. Jake, however, felt the weight of every whisper. Pride had always protected him. Now it felt like a heavy coat he couldn't remove. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing the fence she had mentioned, Jake finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind. "Why did you really agree to this?" he said, tightening a wire. Savannah paused before answering. "I told you already," she said calmly. "Managing my land alone was difficult. That's not the full reason," Jake replied. She looked at him directly. "You kept your word. That matters to me. In a world where people change their minds easily, you didn't." He had made the promise out of pride. She had respected him for honoring it. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, their routine became smoother. Savannah reorganized the ranch accounts and found mistakes that had been costing Jake money for years. She negotiated better prices for supplies. She suggested rotating grazing areas to protect the soil. At first, Jake resisted some of her ideas. He had always done things his way. Change made him uncomfortable. But when he saw results, healthier cattle, fewer repairs, better savings, he couldn't deny her intelligence. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted in orange and purple. "It's peaceful here," Savannah said softly. "You get used to it," Jake replied. "I don't think I want to get used to it," she said. "I want to appreciate it." Jake realized that he had stopped noticing the beauty of his own land. For him, it had always been about work and reputation. For her, it seemed to be something more. As days passed, small moments began to build quiet understanding between them. She learned how he preferred his coffee. He learned that she hummed softly when she was focused. She discovered that despite his confident image, he sometimes worried about failing his late father's legacy. He learned that she had moved to town to start fresh after years of feeling unseen in a bigger city. Their conversations slowly shifted from ranch matters to personal stories. One night during a power outage caused by strong winds, they lit lanterns and sat at the kitchen table. Without electricity, without distractions, they talked longer than ever before. Jake spoke about his childhood, about growing up learning to ride before he could properly read. He admitted that winning the rodeo had become his identity. "If I'm not the best," he said quietly, "who am I?" "You're more than a trophy," she replied. "You just never gave yourself permission to be." It felt like support. Meanwhile, the town continued to watch. People noticed that the ranch looked better maintained. They noticed that Jake seemed calmer, less quick to argue. They noticed Savannah riding alongside him during morning rounds. One afternoon, Mason visited unexpectedly. He walked around the property, observing improvements. "Well," he said jokingly, "looks like losing wasn't the worst thing." "No," Jake admitted slowly, "it wasn't." But even as things improved, uncertainty still existed between them. They had entered marriage as an agreement. They respected each other. They worked well together. Yet neither of them spoke about feelings. Neither of them mentioned the future beyond practical partnership. Late one evening, Savannah stood alone near the fence line, looking at the wide open land. Jake approached quietly. "Regretting it?" he asked gently. She turned toward him. "No," she said after a moment. "I just didn't expect it to feel real." "Does it?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, "more than I thought it would." Her honesty made his chest tighten slightly. For the first time, Jake understood that this marriage was no longer about a bet. It was no longer about proving himself to his friends. It was becoming something deeper. Trust was forming. Respect was growing, and though neither of them said it out loud, something else was beginning too. Something neither had planned and neither had expected. The cowboy who once believed he needed no one was slowly learning that partnership did not weaken him. It strengthened him. And Savannah, the woman many underestimated, was quietly becoming the heart of the ranch. But life on open land is never simple. Just as comfort began to settle in, dark clouds started forming on the horizon, both in the sky and in their future. Neither of them knew that their growing partnership would soon be tested in a way that would reveal who they truly were. By the time autumn arrived, the ranch no longer felt divided between two strangers. It felt shared. The mornings were cooler now, and the wind carried the dry scent of hay across the open land. Jake and Savannah had settled into a rhythm that surprised them both. They woke before sunrise each day. Sometimes Jake would already be outside checking the horses when Savannah joined him with 2 cups of coffee. Other mornings, she would be the first one awake, reviewing the ranch accounts at the kitchen table, while soft light entered through the windows. They did not speak about feelings, but they no longer avoided each other either. Still, something inside Jake remained unsettled. He had always been the strongest voice in any room. On the ranch, he had made every decision without question. Now, he found himself asking Savannah what she thought. And what troubled him most was that her ideas often made more sense than his. One afternoon, while discussing plans to expand a grazing area, Jake insisted on doing things the traditional way. "That's how my father did it," he said firmly. Savannah looked at the map spread across the table. "I understand that. But the soil isn't the same anymore. If we push too hard, we'll damage it long term." Jake felt irritation rise in his chest. "I've managed this land my whole life, and I'm not saying you haven't," she replied calmly. "I'm saying we can make it better." He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in his own home. The conversation ended without agreement. Jake walked outside, frustration heavy in his steps. Pride had always guided him. It had helped him win competitions, command respect, and protect his name, but now that same pride felt like a wall. That evening, dark clouds gathered quickly. The air changed. The wind grew stronger than usual. Ranchers in town had warned about an approaching storm, but no one expected it to arrive so suddenly. Within minutes, the sky turned gray. Dust swirled across the fields. The horses grew restless. Jake rushed to secure the barn doors, while Savannah helped guide the cattle closer to shelter. Rain began pouring heavily, hitting the roof like a drum. As Jake struggled with the loose metal panel, a sharp movement from a frightened horse caused him to lose his balance. He landed hard against the wooden fence, pain shooting through his shoulder. He clenched his teeth and stood up, ignoring the discomfort. Inside the barn, Savannah noticed something was wrong. She hurried toward him through the rain. "Are you hurt?" she asked, raising her voice over the storm. "I'm fine," he insisted, though his arm felt weak, but Savannah could see it in his face. She didn't argue. She immediately took control. "Go inside," she said firmly. "I'll finish here." Jake stared at her, surprised by her command. "You can't handle this alone." There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. For the next hour, Savannah moved quickly and confidently. She directed 2 workers who had arrived to help. She secured the remaining panels, checked on the animals, and ensured the gates were locked tightly. From the porch, holding his injured shoulder, Jake watched in silence. He had always believed that strength meant doing everything himself. Yet here was Savannah, standing strong, in the middle of chaos, not for attention, not for praise, but because it needed to be done. When the storm finally passed, the ranch looked tired but safe. Savannah walked back toward the house, her clothes wet and her hair loose from its tie. She looked exhausted but steady. "You should see a doctor," she said softly, glancing at his shoulder. "It's nothing," Jake replied automatically. She gave him a look that clearly said she didn't believe him. Inside the house, she carefully cleaned a small cut near his arm and wrapped his shoulder with support. Her movements were gentle but confident. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said quietly while tying the bandage. "You don't have to be unbreakable all the time." Over the next few days, Jake was forced to rest more than he liked. His shoulder needed time to recover. Tasks he normally handled alone were now being managed by Savannah, and she handled them well. She met suppliers, inspected repairs from the storm, and even negotiated a better deal on feed delivery. Workers listened to her because she spoke clearly and respectfully. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand control. She earned it. Jake began noticing things he had overlooked before. He noticed how she remembered each worker's name, how she asked about their families, how she thanked them personally after long days. The ranch felt different, lighter. One evening, Mason visited again. "Looks like she runs the place now," Mason joked lightly, though there was admiration in his voice. Jake didn't laugh. "She kept everything together," he admitted. "If she hadn't stepped up during the storm, we would have lost more than fences." Mason studied his friend carefully. "You sound different." Jake leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I am." Later that night, Jake found Savannah sitting on the porch alone, watching the stars. "You were right about the grazing land," he said suddenly. She turned toward him, surprised. "About what?" "We should try it your way," he continued. "The soil matters more than tradition." A small smile appeared on her face. "We'll try it together." That word, together, felt new and meaningful. For the first time, Jake didn't feel threatened by her strength. He felt supported by it. Days passed, and the ranch slowly showed signs of recovery from the storm. The repaired fences stood firm. The cattle remained healthy. The new grazing plan began showing positive results. People in town started noticing something else, too. Jake no longer spoke with sharp pride. He listened more. He argued less. When someone praised him for the ranch's condition, he mentioned Savannah's name without hesitation. "She's the reason things are improving," he would say simply. And Savannah, when thanked for her hard work, always responded the same way. "We're building it together." Their partnership was no longer an arrangement. It was becoming trust. But deep inside Jake, one fear still remained. What if she realized she deserved more than a marriage that started as a bet? What if one day she decided to leave? The thought unsettled him more than losing any rodeo ever had. One quiet evening, as they finished checking the fields, Savannah stopped walking and looked at him seriously. "You've changed," she said. He hesitated. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," she replied softly. "It's brave." Jake felt something shift again inside his chest. He had spent years believing bravery meant holding on tightly to pride, but now he understood something different. Bravery was admitting when you needed someone. Bravery was sharing control. Bravery was allowing yourself to grow. As the wind moved gently across the open land, Jake realized that losing the rodeo had broken something in him, but in that broken space, something better had begun to grow. And though neither of them knew what challenges would come next, one truth had become clear. The cowboy who once feared losing was learning that sometimes losing pride is the first step toward becoming stronger. Winter arrived quietly that year. The air turned sharp in the mornings, and a thin layer of frost covered the fields before sunrise. The ranch looked peaceful from a distance, but life on it never truly slowed down. There were animals to feed, repairs to finish, and plans to make for the coming spring. Jake and Savannah had grown used to working side by side. Their conversations were no longer careful or distant. They joked sometimes. They disagreed sometimes. But even their disagreements felt different now. Calmer, built on respect instead of pride. Still, something unspoken remained between them. Their marriage had started as a promise. It had turned into partnership. But neither of them had clearly said what it meant beyond that. One afternoon, while Jake was in town buying supplies, a sleek black truck pulled up near Savannah's land. It stood out immediately among the dusty ranch vehicles. The driver stepped out wearing polished boots and a neatly pressed coat. His name was Daniel Harper. Savannah froze for a brief second when she saw him. She had not expected to see anyone from her past in this small town. Daniel removed his gloves slowly, looking around with a faint smile. "So this is where you disappeared to," he said. Savannah kept her posture steady. "I didn't disappear. I moved." Daniel had known her years ago in the city. Back then, he had admired her intelligence and calm strength. They had once spoken about building the future together. But when Savannah decided she wanted a quieter life and independence, Daniel had chosen ambition over her. Now he was standing in front of her again. "I heard about your marriage," he continued. "Hard to believe." "It surprised many people," Savannah replied evenly. Daniel looked toward the ranch house. "You married a cowboy because of a bet?" "It's more complicated than that," she said. He studied her face carefully. "You don't belong here. You deserve more than dust and fences." Savannah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she asked, "Why are you here, Daniel?" "I'm expanding my business into nearby counties. I need land. I also need someone I trust to help manage it. I thought of you." She understood what he was offering. Stability. Comfort. A life closer to the one she once knew. "You could leave all this behind," he added gently. "Start fresh. With me." At that exact moment, Jake's truck appeared at the far end of the road. He slowed down as he noticed the unfamiliar vehicle parked near his home. When he stepped out and saw Savannah speaking to a well-dressed stranger, something tightened inside him. Daniel turned as Jake approached. The two men looked at each other carefully. "I'm Daniel," he said politely, extending a hand. Jake shook it firmly. "Jake." There was no open hostility, but there was tension. Savannah quickly explained that Daniel was an old acquaintance. Jake nodded, though questions were already forming in his mind. That evening, Daniel stayed longer than expected. He spoke about opportunities in the city, about growth and financial success. His words were smooth and confident. Jake listened quietly at first, but the more Daniel spoke, the more unsettled he felt. After Daniel finally left, silence filled the house. Jake stood near the window, staring outside. "It didn't tell me about him," he said carefully. "There was nothing to tell," Savannah replied. "He's part of my past. He seems like more than that." She looked at him directly. "Are you asking me something, or are you accusing me?" Old pride and new fear mixed together. "He offered you a way out, didn't he?" Jake asked. Savannah didn't deny it. "He offered me a different life." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. "And are you considering it?" he asked quietly. She took a deep breath. "I'm considering what's best for me, just like anyone would." Jake felt frustration rising again, the same way it had during their early disagreements. But this time it wasn't about land or decisions. It was about losing her. "So this was always temporary?" he said, unable to hide the hurt in his voice. "Just until something better came along?" Savannah's expression changed instantly. "That's not fair," she said firmly. "I have worked beside you every day. I stood with you during the storm. I chose to stay when people doubted this marriage." Jake's voice softened slightly, but doubt remained. "Then why even think about leaving?" "Because I never knew if you truly wanted this," she answered honestly. "You married me to keep your word, not because you chose me." Her words filled the room with heavy truth. Jake had never clearly told her that his feelings had changed. He had assumed she understood, but assumptions were not enough. The next morning, Daniel returned briefly before leaving town. He asked to speak with Savannah one last time near the edge of the property. Jake watched from a distance, uncertainty pulling at him. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw Daniel gesture toward his truck, then toward the horizon, as if pointing to a larger world beyond the ranch. Savannah listened quietly. Then she shook her head. Daniel looked disappointed, but nodded respectfully. After a final handshake, he drove away. Jake approached slowly once the truck disappeared from sight. "Well?" he asked. Savannah met his eyes. I told him no. Relief washed over Jake, but he didn't smile immediately. "Why?" he asked. She stepped closer, her voice steady but emotional. "Because I don't want a life built only on comfort. I want a life built on meaning. And whether you realize it or not, we've built something meaningful here. I stayed," she continued, "not because of a bet, not because I had no options. I stayed because I believe in what we are becoming." He finally understood the depth of her choice. It had not been about land. It had not been about convenience. She had chosen him. But he also realized something else. He had never clearly chosen her out loud. "I was afraid," Jake admitted slowly. "Of what?" she asked. "Of not being enough. Of you waking up one day and realizing you deserved better than a stubborn cowboy who lost a rodeo." Savannah's eyes softened. "You were never just a cowboy lost," she said. "You're a man who kept his promise, a man who learned to share control, a man who changed." Jake stepped closer, no longer hiding behind pride. "I don't want this marriage to be about a bet anymore," he said. "I want it to be about us, about choosing each other every day." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cold winter wind moved gently around them, but the tension that had filled the air since Daniel's arrival was gone. Savannah finally smiled, not the polite smile she gave townspeople, but a warm, genuine one. "Then choose me," she said softly. And this time, Jake didn't hesitate. "I do," he answered. There was no audience, no applause, just two people standing on open land, making a real decision for the first time. The ranch looked the same as it had the day before. The fences, the barn, the endless fields. But something inside their marriage had shifted completely. It was no longer built on obligation. It was built on choice. And that choice would soon be tested again, not by outsiders, not by pride, but by the expectations of the entire town that still watched them closely, waiting to see whether this unlikely union would truly last. Spring arrived slowly, as if the land itself wanted to be sure winter was truly gone. The frost disappeared from the fields and small green shoots began pushing through the soil. The ranch felt alive again. Birds returned to the trees. The air felt softer. And for Jake and Savannah, everything felt different too. Since the day Daniel left town, there had been a quiet clarity between them. No more unspoken doubts. No more guessing what the other felt. They had chosen each other, not because of a bet, not because of pressure, but because they wanted to build something real. Still, the town had not forgotten how their marriage began. The annual rodeo was approaching again. It was the biggest event of the year. People from nearby counties would gather, stands would be set up, music would play, children would run around excitedly. And of course, everyone expected Jake Turner to compete again. Some believed he would return stronger than ever. Others whispered that he had changed too much, that marriage had softened him. Jake heard the comments but didn't respond. This time the rodeo meant something different to him. One evening, as he adjusted his saddle in the barn, Savannah walked in quietly. "You're thinking about it," she said. "About what?" he asked, though he knew. "The rodeo." Jake leaned against the wooden wall. "I don't need to prove anything anymore." Savannah stepped closer. "Maybe not to them. What about to yourself?" He looked at her carefully. "You don't have to win," she continued, "but you should ride because you love it, not because you're afraid of losing." Jake realized something important. The last time he had competed, he rode to protect his pride. When he lost, he felt like he had lost part of his identity, but now he no longer defined himself by a trophy. He defined himself by the life he was building. The morning of the rodeo arrived bright and clear. The sky stretched wide and blue above the arena. The town buzzed with energy. Vendors sold snacks. Old friends greeted each other warmly, and whispers followed Jake as he walked through the crowd, with Savannah beside him. They no longer walked, with distance between them. Their shoulders nearly touched. Their steps matched naturally. "You nervous?" Mason asked as he approached. Jake smiled slightly. "Not like last year." Mason looked between him and Savannah and grinned. Guess losing wasn't such bad luck after all. Jake glanced at his wife and replied calmly, "It was the best thing that happened to me." When Jake entered the arena, the crowd cheered loudly, some out of habit, some out of curiosity. Everyone wanted to see if the once proud champion could reclaim his title. He adjusted his hat and mounted his horse. For a moment, everything became quiet in his mind. The noise faded. The pressure disappeared. He wasn't riding to silence gossip. He wasn't riding to defend his name. He was riding because it was part of who he was, and because he knew someone believed in him no matter the outcome. The first round went smoothly. His movements were steady and controlled, not aggressive, not rushed. In the second round, a younger competitor delivered an impressive performance. The crowd roared loudly. Jake felt a familiar challenge rising inside him, but it didn't turn into pride. It turned into focus. Before the final round, he looked toward the stands. Savannah stood near the front, her eyes locked on him. She didn't shout. She didn't wave wildly. She simply watched with quiet confidence. And that was enough. When Jake entered the arena for the final time, he rode with calm strength. Every movement felt balanced. Every second felt clear. He wasn't fighting the horse. He was working with it. When the ride ended, the applause was louder than before. The tension built slowly. People leaned forward in their seats. Then the result came. Jake had won. But the victory felt different this time. There was no overwhelming rush of pride. No loud celebration inside his chest. Instead, he felt gratitude. As the announcer called his name, Jake did something no one expected. Instead of raising his hat high and circling the arena alone, he dismounted and walked directly toward the stands. The crowd grew quieter, curious. Jake stopped in front of Savannah and extended his hand. She looked surprised, but took it. He helped her step into the arena with him. Murmurs spread through the audience. Jake then turned toward the crowd and spoke clearly. "Last year I lost this rodeo," he said. "I thought it was the worst moment of my life. I was wrong. Losing taught me something I never understood before. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about who stands beside you when you do." The arena became completely silent. He looked at Savannah. "This woman didn't marry me because I won. Oh, she stayed when I was uncertain. She worked beside me. She believed in me before I believed in myself." Savannah's eyes filled with emotion, but she stood steady. Jake continued, "Today's win doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to us." For a town that had once laughed at their marriage, the moment felt powerful. Mason wiped his face discreetly, pretending dust had gotten into his eyes. After the ceremony, as people slowly returned to their conversations, Jake and Savannah walked back toward the ranch together. "You didn't have to say all that," Savannah said softly. "Yes, I did," Jake replied. "For too long I let pride speak for me. Today, I wanted honesty to speak." Back at the ranch that evening, the sky turned golden once again. It looked similar to the sunset on the day they had first arrived home as husband and wife, but everything felt deeper now. Jake walked into the house and returned holding the small folder. "I went to town last week," he said. Savannah looked curious. "For what?" He handed her the papers. She opened them slowly and froze. He had legally transferred half of the ranch ownership fully into her name. "You were always my partner in work," he said quietly. "Now you're my equal in everything." Savannah looked up at him, overwhelmed. "You don't owe me this," she whispered. "I'm not giving it because I owe you," Jake replied. "I'm giving it because I choose you." The wind moved gently outside, carrying the peaceful sounds of the ranch they had rebuilt together. Their marriage had started as a joke among friends. It had grown through storms, doubts, and unexpected visitors from the past. And now it stood strong, not because of a bet, not because of gossip, but because two people had learned to let go of pride and hold on to partnership. The biggest shock to the town was not that Jake won the rodeo again. It was that the once stubborn cowboy had transformed into a man who understood that true strength comes from respect, humility, and love. As night settled over the land, Jake and Savannah stood side by side on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. Neither of them knew what challenges the future would bring, but they knew one thing clearly. This time, they would face it together.